trucks, they have excavators. They are not doing it on small scale.
The logistics of that must be horrific.
It's crazy. I just felt so completely helpless about how do you change this?
Where do you think Australian businesses are getting it right?
Their ability to bring Australian technology, Australian health and safety, Australian way of working, need is only going to increase and continues to increase. So I'm extremely optimistic about the opportunity, what it is. I think...
What about critical minerals?
Critical minerals is a fascinating
She's a hot
space.
topic.
It's a hot topic, mate. And in the West Australian context, it means nothing, right? So you're effectively starting again from scratch. It really is. We are very blessed and lucky to be in a place like this.
Welcome back to the first episode of 2026 on the Gold Room podcast. I hope you all had a bloody awesome holiday. I did. Shot off to the beach and spent some time with the family. It was bloody ripper. Today in the studio, lucky enough to have Doug Horak. Thank you very much for joining me, mate. Much appreciated.
You're very welcome, mate. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Not a problem. Do you have a good break, mate? Or did you have a break?
I did have a break. We had a couple of weeks where closed the office sort of 19th December odd, and then just 2 weeks to just catch up and not do anything at all, actually. It was great. It's really good.
It's a good feeling, eh? After having a bloody hectic year, it's really nice to sink a few frothies, kick the shoes off, get rid of the suit jacket.
And also Perth's the perfect place to be, right? I mean, for holidays, it really is. We are very blessed and lucky to be in a place like this, honestly.
We sure are.
Terrific place.
People get sick of me saying it all the time. Anyway, Doug, we always kick everything off, every episode off with the life and the times, mate. So take us back to the early years. Obviously, with that really thick accent there, you've got an awesome story to tell.
Well, we'll see. I don't know about awesome, but it's a story anyway, right? So I grew up on a farm about an hour and a bit out of Johannesburg, out on the west, so sort of out past Krugersdorp, Brandfontein on the sort of Viljoens Kroon Road, Kroonstad area, out Magaliesberg way.
Is that towards Kruger National Park?
Opposite end.
What's that bloody? Is it close to Sun City?
So it's on the road to Sun City.
Yeah, okay. I thought so.
That's right.
Recalled that name.
Yeah. And I suppose, like most kids that grew up on a farm, a sister and a younger brother, we spent our lives outdoors, running around. Didn't see parents for days. If we ever caught telling my mum we were bored, it was going to be that was problematic, right? Yeah. So we had an amazing childhood, and I think you don't realize at the time what you have, right? So we then went to a local primary school. It was the only.
How many brothers and sisters?
I had a sister, and I've got one brother, younger than me. Local primary school. It was the only English school in our region, so predominantly Afrikaans-based area we grew up in, and then went off to high school to all-boys government high school, Potch Boys High. My dad had actually been to that school, so he was an old boy there, and growing up heard a lot of stories about it, and so it was a very easy and natural progression, and it was a very interesting learning, I guess. You and I see kids here leave home very early, right from the rural areas to go, schooling and things. And as a youngster going off to boarding school, I certainly wasn't immune to being homesick for the first period.
Just reminds me of that movie Power of One, mate. A little PK.
Yes, PK. Yeah, it's an interesting book, right? Great book.
Bryce Courtney?
Yeah, sorry?
Is it Bryce Courtney?
Yes, Bryce Courtney. It taught you so much. And I think the one thing that stuck with me coming out of school, or two things. One was that at a very young age, you certainly got to appreciate your parents and your family, right? So being taken out of that situation, you suddenly realize how much they do for you that you just take for granted quite comfortably. And so you learn a lot and you grow a lot as a kid, right? And it was, in those days, fortunately, a very good school. I loved my sport. I was too small to actually play rugby, and so I ended up playing hockey.
Oh, okay.
And ended up playing hockey for most of my life, certainly through my studying years, and then a bit of that post club hockey and things as well. And studied down in Natal at what is now called the Durban University of Technology.
KwaZulu-Natal?
Yep. Yeah, and in Durban.
Yep.
And hockey, I studied marketing and sales management course. Hockey played a huge amount of, it took up a lot of time. I was coaching as well, and we had a lot of fun. It was
Awesome.
a great time. Post-school, I spent 2 years doing military service. So we all had to do conscription, 2 years of military service when I was still there. In fact, the year I was completing, they then reduced it to a year, and a few years later, they kicked it in the touch completely.
Oh, really?
And I think that as well was a fascinating time, right? It was very interesting from a general exposure to different people perspective, right? And a classic is, I'd been in for about 6 months, and one of the guys that arrived, or 3 months, I think, and one of the guys that arrived with me on our intake, he literally arrived with a plastic bag. It had a single polish brush and a tiny tin of polish. And that's all he had, right? Because they give you a list of things that they suggest you bring. So extra PT shorts, PT shirts, socks, those sorts of things. And then they issue with the standard browns and helmets and all of that sort of stuff. But this kid literally arrived just with that. That's all he had. He didn't even have a toothbrush.
Wow.
And then at the other end of the scale, a chap dropped his son by helicopter on the parade ground. And so it
he get bullied?
He was a fascinating guy, and I haven't seen him in God knows how long, but he actually was a really interesting kid.
Who, the rich fella?
Yeah, yeah. And I think and at a time when I last checked in, had gone on to do quite a lot of good stuff.
Awesome.
But just such a different, disparity in terms of what you were there. And the great thing about that from, again, a people perspective is everyone is the same. You start at the bottom. Doesn't matter where you came from, who you were, what you did. And it was, again, a massively important period that really helped shape what I ended up doing. And again, spent, fortunately, a lot of time playing hockey.
Yep.
My timing just happened to be really good at that point because the team that was playing in our region, in our command area, just happened to be full of really good hockey players. And I was sort of just good enough to actually get in and play with these guys. So I had 2 years of phenomenal hockey and phenomenal learning.
Awesome.
And then went on to play with them later on in life as well. And so for me, I was very fortunate, and certainly some of the other guys I went to the military service with weren't as lucky, and I mean that happens, I guess. But yeah, it just reminds you of what you have and what you haven't got, and what to appreciate and what you learn from, right? And again,
sure.
You also get exposed to a very different sort of style of management and leadership, right? Because it's a very different space to anything else you come across, right? I mean, boarding school sets you up in a small way, right? Where you've got your seniors leading discipline and your house-masters and your then school management and things. But again, very sort of hierarchical army military structure sort of, and
Would you say your time in the military has guided and shaped the way that you lead today?
I don't know. I would have to say it has, right? But I think all of our experiences does. They certainly shift or shape your approach to things, and that good or bad, irrelevant, right? I don't think you're going to experience anything for a period of like 2 years, for example, and not have it impact, right? Same as boys at a boys' high school, right? So I think all of those sorts of things absolutely shift and shape how you approach things. I think it also comes down a lot to what you're willing to be receptive to, right? And what you take from it. So you could go in and you could have the shittest time in the world. And you see that. You see guys that really struggle, right? Really, really struggle. And sometimes, again, didn't end up well for a lot of them that really, really struggled, because in those days there wasn't a lot of mental health support, right? So those sorts of things are...
What year? What year was that?
So that would have been 87, 88.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, finished school 86, 87, 88, and then studied 89, 1991. And then actually headed to the UK for just under 3 years. And in fact, when I moved to the UK, it was a sort of traveling holiday. South Africa still, or South Africans weren't allowed to work internationally, right? Because we still had huge amounts of sanctions against South Africa as a result of the apartheid era, right? And in fact, when I was in London and working in the UK in 94, that was then repealed, and South Africans got, I think, about 95 probably were allowed to work, and it was an issue and things. But again, 3 years overseas, or just under 3 years overseas, shapes your life, right?
What were you doing in that time?
So working at pubs, traveling around the UK, I ended up also being extremely fortunate to picked up a job with a group called TGI Fridays. Now, they're an American bistro-style restaurant. I'd never heard of them before.
They're all over the shop now.
Yeah, they are, right. And the general manager at the time, a phenomenal man, and probably one of the guys I learnt the most from as a youngster coming into the industry. His name was Jonathan Grenville Gray. Phenomenal guy, and very fascinating history, right? So his mum, I hope I'm going to get this right. His mum married an Englishman, but because his mum was related to Thabo Mbeki, who was the next president after Nelson Mandela, and during the 80s or 70s, they had been expelled from the country. So he had grown up in the UK, and he was just a fascinating individual and just so on song. And when it comes to understanding how to run a restaurant and how to, the service industry per se, like he was incredible. Just learning how, from a leadership management perspective, and also from that customer experience perspective, right? He was absolutely incredibly. And then got back to South Africa post that. That would have been sort of 96-ish, or mid-96 to end of 96. Did a couple of sort of restaurant manager style roles for a bit, but then wanted to get back into a sort of marketing type role, because that's what I'd studied.
Yep.
And I got introduced to a very small software development company, and I started as an assistant marketer, and sort of did some marketing and sales, and then evolved over time. And then that little company grew from, I think there were 5, 6 of us when I arrived at that company. And then that grew, and I think it was about 8, 9 years later when I eventually left. I was sort of at that point in time, I was COO. I think we'd grown to about 30-odd people.
Wow, awesome.
And had grown into a really much bigger company, supplying very niche software. So we specialized in the golf industry, so all of the systems in golf clubs. So effectively the business and the software and hardware allowed clubs to move into a completely cashless environment, so that they wouldn't be targets or less of a target from a crime perspective. And that then linked into a national handicapping system which was developed on a card, and that could sort of capture your score post rounds across the country, wherever you were. And then I think it was about 2000 and must have been 4-ish, I think. If I take a step back, I think it was around 2000, my brother and his wife moved to Australia. So they had an opportunity to come out. Sharon already had her PR visa, and they had some time to take it up. And so came out here. And so once that happened, that always was an option for us. My sister at the time had lived in Durban and then had moved back to Johannesburg around that sort of time, about 2003, I think. And she was on the farm with my folks. She'd come out of a horrifically abusive relationship, which fortunately then did come to an end. And then we lost her very tragically in a car accident in 2004.
Sorry, mate.
And these, going back to the military and going back to boarding school and overseas, these are events that sort of really shape things and change things, right? So again, certainly for me, it was a very hard look at what was important, why were things important, what was it about?
Yeah.
And she and I were extremely close. I came from a very close family, very luckily. And so I really, really struggled with that. And I say this, I think 6 months post Joe being killed in a car accident, a very good mate of mine asked me how I was doing. And I sort of brushed it off and I said, no, I'm fine, everything's fine, keeping an eye on the folks and seeing how things are going. Rog, my brother, had already moved here. And she took one look at me and eventually said, you know what, you're actually not. I've known you long enough to know you're not. And so she put me in touch with a counseling guy, and probably the best thing I ever did.
It's awesome. It's good to hear.
It really helped me understand and deal with what grief was like and how that happened. But again, in these sort of, I say life-changing things that happen or you get exposure to, my marriage didn't survive that. And my ex and I are still good mates today. We still keep in touch regularly. But once that sort of, I think that ended about a year later, memory serves. And at that point in time, and going through this, I'm trying to understand where you're going to fit in or what do you want to do with things. My brother and his wife, Sharon, had just had their first little boy in Perth. And so family immediately becomes, well, for me, became that much more important. And so I then started making plans to get over here.
And did you have any, before coming to Australia, did you have any mining aspirations? What did you know about mining? Did the love for mining start back in South Africa, or did you pick it up over here?
No, that's an interesting question, Josh, because we grew up, my dad was a geologist, right? So whether we liked it or not, we were involved in mining at a level. So we were always hearing stories about Dad, and some incredible stories when he was a youngster exploring as an exploration geo, right? Not only in Africa, but ended up in Canada as well.
Wow.
And all over the place.
Awesome.
And so it was always part of the conversation, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And he then, years later, in fact, I think we were still at junior school, and he was the head geo of a group at the time called JCI. He was the chief geologist. And he said that one day he was coming back from a meeting in Johannesburg city centre, and he looked up and he saw this tiny little patch of blue sky. And he's just like, nah, this is not for him. And he walked in and handed his resignation in. And the chap who was heading up JCI at the time, or JCI at the time, wasn't overly excited about it and said, listen, just take a couple of months, think about it, take 3 months, whatever. And And he just said that was it. And so he then went farming. And so he came back home, and it was a great time of all of our lives, because Dad was taking us to school. So we'd see him in the mornings. He'd be testing us on our times table on the way to school, spelling. And so that mining sort of thing remained with us. Later on in life, he ended up spending and doing a lot of consulting for mining companies as a geo, just because of his incredible knowledge of the Witwatersrand Reef and a lot of the gold and other gold sort of mines in that region. And so once you hit to Western Australia, you're involved in mining, right? Doesn't matter what you're doing. And so getting here initially, because I had a sort of marketing IT background, it was difficult to find a company or a conversation, whether it was recruiters who could understand the context of what I'd done previously, right? So it was hard to explain. They had no idea, no context of the system that we had developed, the massive deals we'd done with different banks, with big global, with Africa-based mobile networks. And so it was incredible. What we managed to achieve was incredible. But in the West Australian context, it means nothing, right? So you're effectively starting again from scratch, right? So you've got to build your contacts again, start up, really try and understand what's going on, get your head around what Western Australia is like, what the opportunities are. And in fact, I arrived mid-2007 and just got frustrated by not getting interviews, not actually getting somewhere eventually. And I'd wanted to avoid going back into the restaurant industry, and then just out of sheer wanting something to do, ended up at Coco's and working as in South Perth as a kitchen hand, right? So chopping up vegetables, chucking out the bins, cleaning the floors, pots, pans, getting things organized, and did that for a few months. And then the executive chef and I started chatting one day, and he's like, "Doug, but you seem to know your way around the restaurant, the kitchen. What is going on? We don't have a CV for you on file." And I was like, I spent a lot of time in restaurants, but I really didn't want to get back into it. And he said, "Look, there's no ways I'm having you back here." So he pushed me in front of a house. He said, "Get to know all the wines, get to understand how the systems run, and then we want to put you in one of the other restaurants." And so strange how things then take a different turn, right? Because one evening I was pouring a bottle of wine for 3 guests. It was an older gentleman at the table, chatting, asked me a couple of questions through the night, nothing specific or, just general conversation. And at the end of the evening, he gave me his business card and he said, "Doug, I want you to come work for me. Phone these guys on Monday, set up a conversation." And I was like, "Don't know who you are." He's like, "Just phone them."
What did his card say, mate? What was the name on the card?
Peter Tanner.
Okay.
And Peter Tanner started, or was the founder of a company, a recruitment company called Tanner Menzies, based on the East Coast. And they'd opened an office here. And they were looking at then opening or setting up a global recruitment division, for want of a better word. So a little department where you would, because of the networks I had both in South Africa and the UK, trying to bring skills in and then deploy those in the West Australian market, right? Particularly mining, right? And oil and gas. And so ended up there for about 8 or 9 months. And then in that process, the company Tanner Menzies was acquired by another company, and I forget now who they were. And so that shifted the focus a little bit. And then within months was reacquired by another large global company. I think Randstad eventually acquired them. And so their focus had shifted completely around what we were doing. And so that was the first time I was made redundant, right? And I think in Western Australia, you are going to bump into that at some point.
Yep.
And while this was going on, I had, in terms of trying to establish my business networks and connections and build a base, had connected into a local business council, which was the Australia Africa Business Council. And then I'd hosted and run an expat networking group. And I think I ran that for about 5 or 6 years, maybe a bit longer. I can't remember now. both of those experiences started sort of setting things up without me actively realizing this. And so I then consulted for a couple of years on the business development space for a few companies. And then I was approached by one of the partners at Deloitte. And they said to me they were busy setting up an Africa desk internally in their Perth business. And he and another guy were going to be heading this up. And would I make some introductions because of the work I was doing with the business council? Could we make some connections and see where that goes? Which we then did. And about a year later, the guy that was going to be driving it internally got headhunted out of Deloitte.
Okay.
And so the same partner then approached me and said, listen, Doug, would you be interested in coming on full-time with us and effectively running the Africa Services Group? And at the very base level, it was leveraging the Deloitte offices not only in Western Australia, but across Africa to then enable Australian companies operating in Africa. And so I spent the next number of years with Deloitte doing that, certainly the first 2 years doing that. Post that, we had a bit of a shift with the global financial crisis. Africa dropped off a bit. I started doing some other work with Deloitte. I then finished off with them around February, I think. Must have been 16, I think. Back to consulting. And then my brother got hold of me and said, listen, Doug, we're having some issues on our family farm back in South Africa. Would you go and spend 3 months on the farm, see if you can reorganize, restructure some of the things? There was an investor or looking like some investment coming into the farm that would expand the blueberry operations. I think the plan initially was it was at about 10 hectares. It was going to take it to another 20 and then eventually to 30 hectares. And so we needed some work on the structure of that business, going from a relatively small hobby, not quite hobby farm, but it needed some structure and things. And so I spent initially we thought it was going to be about 3 months. It turned out to be 6 months, working, reorganizing, restructuring, got new management in, dealt with a number of issues, as you can imagine, some very, very unpleasant. But when you're in those environments, that's also expected to a degree. You know, you're dealing with communities and you're trying to manage not only expectations, but you're also trying to manage how of an employer of a lot of people, how you manage that and the engagement of that local community. And it's never as simple as it seems. There are a phenomenal amount of nuances around finding out who the people in the community are that are actually sort of power brokers, if you want for a better word, who almost behind the scenes direct a lot of the stuff that you don't realize. And so once you start digging into that, you start understanding the complexity of it. And then we also had a number of foreign workers working in our operations, all work visas, all legally. But again, that didn't really matter a lot of the time. So the local communities, even though they lived with them, were at times very unhappy about it. And so you constantly having to be aware of security, constantly having to be aware of how you best look after the people that are working for you and how you can protect them, right? So, and it got a bit ropey at times. It settled down after about 6 months or so, got things structured. The investment came in, and the plan was then coming back to Perth. I had caught up with a gent at Mining Indaba in Cape Town, and he said to me, Doug, what are your plans, for what are you doing work-wise and things? And I explained I was coming to the end of this consulting period, and he said, I'm looking to retire. I currently look after Africa for Intertek, Geologist, and they were a laboratory group, geochem group. And would you be interested in having a conversation later in the year about whether that's something you'd be keen to do? And so then that was useful for me. It sounded like a really good fit in terms of my sort of experience between Australia and Africa. One of the things that I'd done when I was with Deloitte, which was also quite different from the traditional Deloitte sort of things, was a group of 3 execs from a very large global logistics group wanted to go and investigate Africa. And I ended up taking 3 of them into 5 different countries, and we had a look at infrastructure projects, looked at the oil and gas sector, looked at the rail space, what was going on. And that was Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, South Africa.
Wow.
Just to give them an understanding of what it was like operating on the ground. And
the difficulties associated with it.
yeah, and also trying to show them that even if something was presented in the paper as an opportunity, for example, even if it was government gazetted, the opportunity for a railway or for railway management or whatever it is, once you start doing some digging and uncovering as to what's going on, realizing that that contract had been signed a year ago and another company had already been allocated, they were now just going through the process. So this actually wasn't an opportunity at all. It was really just about getting through things. So it was a fascinating insight for them into how you operate on the ground. For me, it was incredibly interesting because here were 3 senior guys who had traveled through Asia Pacific coming into Africa, and you could see, although they were comfortable at some degree, how little they understood. And also, I suppose that also twigged inside me is that, wait a minute, the learning I've gone through without even thinking I'd gone through it has actually put me in a position to understand what's going on and see some of these things. And not everything, believe me, but have a better understanding. And so 2017 got back to Perth and then was asked by the CEO at the time of AAMEG, Trish O'Reilly, if I would look and help with some consulting.
That's the Australia, Africa
Minerals and Energy Group. Yeah. And they were looking at trying to see if they could strengthen the sustainability side of this organization. So it was started in 2010, incorporated 2011, and it was a group of mining companies and service companies that operated in Africa. And initially, it was really around trying to understand what the collective impact was in terms of investment in Africa, what the...
Huge,
massive. And what else were they doing right? So the financial investment was one thing, but once you start digging below that, you realize that the infrastructure, the schools, the clinics, the roads, the infrastructure that they're putting in for the local communities, the programs they have in place, and that's always been that way. It was now just an organization that suddenly was trying to help tell the story and feed that information back into federal and state government around this is actually what's happening. West Australia has an incredibly diverse and broad mining sector, and part of it sits in Africa, sure, some in Latin America, Asia Pacific, all over the place, right? Anyway, so getting back to the Trish conversation was around how do we make this organization more sustainable? What are the things? And it was around looking at more commercial aspects of it and what we could do. And I think I just started doing some work for them, and Trish's mum got really ill very quickly. And so Trish asked the board and said, look, I'm going to have to step down. I need to take care of mum. And the board then asked me if I would step in as an interim while they found a new CEO. And at that time, I'd already committed to what was Intertek Geologist at the time, about taking up this role. So we pushed my start date out to the end of that year. And I spent 6 months as interim CEO with AAMEG. Jumped 6 months ahead, started with Intertek, and then spent the next almost 7 years between Perth and Africa. And again, not so much West Africa. We had an office in Accra, but very much servicing our Australian-based mining companies across Africa. So
And were they juniors or majors?
Largely juniors, explorers, and then some of the bigger mid-tiers, right? Okay. So the Perseus's of the world, the West Africa, the Resolutes, the Base Resources, and what was MOD, which is now Sandfire, Paladin, Paladin Energy. And then and at that point in time, there were a number of uranium players in Namibia, Bannerman, Deep Yellow, and they sort of have been through the doldrums for a long time, right? We've only seen that come back more recently. But I spent the next X number of years across that continent. So I was in Gabon. We did some work there. I was in Rwanda at a point. I was in Uganda. And then through southern, central, extensively, right? So, in fact, the probably only places I didn't get to within sort of southern and central, probably Angola and DRC. But the rest of them, lots, and then regular trips. So I'd be getting into Zambia probably 2-3 times a year to see clients. South Africa the same, Zimbabwe the same, and then looking at new opportunities. We did some stuff in Eritrea. I didn't get on the ground in Eritrea, but we had a client in Eritrea as well. I think we looked at some stuff in Ethiopia, and then we'd also investigate other regions, right? So looking at where should we expand, what those opportunities look like from a geochem laboratory perspective, and where the model fit and how that worked. But again, really getting a very good understanding at not only countries, but even regions within countries and how different they operate, right? And you start realizing how complicated it is to operate in these different regions if you don't have that understanding, or you haven't had that experience, or know someone who can assist with that sort of stuff.
So is that where AAMEG comes in?
Very much so.
So let's get into that. Let's get into your current role with AAMEG and what you do, what your team does, and why companies should be approaching you to work with them.
Yeah, AAMEG, effectively, when you strip everything away, the role of what it is we're there to do is to support Australian investment in Africa. And that takes the shape, all sorts of shapes, right? So from mining service companies that are and have been operating in Africa and across the continent for decades, right? 20, 30 years. I mean, the likes of people like Lycopodium and Parenti have been on the ground there, Burncut, for decades and decades, right?
Are you still supporting those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing that we constantly, well, we don't forget, but when we talk about Australia as a continent, it's one place. Yes, we've got states, different state laws and things. Africa, you've got 54 countries, right? So you're dealing with...
The logistics of that must be horrific.
It's crazy. And then you also, so of the 54, you've probably got a roughly 30 that have got a mining segment or sector at some level. 15 of them are probably more mature than the other 15, but they have this constant shifting, changing. A great example now is a service company I was on a call with last week with their founder and a couple of their other senior guys. They've been operating in West Africa for 20 years. But the challenge that they have now on the ground is that local content requirements are shifting continually, and to the point of now it's at this very interesting stage where it's going from local content, which our Australian mining companies and service providers do phenomenally well. I mean, I think Sandfire is like 98% locally employed people in Botswana, right? So they have a very skinny expat group, and
which is great for the communities.
It's what it's supposed to be. And again, Paladin Energy, great example, because they consider themselves...
Is it Paul Hembrow?
Paul, yeah. And they consider themselves effectively as a Namibian company, right? They operate in Namibia. That's what they're there to do.
Yep.
So
are they doing a good job?
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing job. And I think this is the thing. And again, part of what AAMEG is doing and trying to do better through our awards, sort of AAMEG awards, is telling those stories about the impact these guys are having, what they're doing, what difference they are making. Because it's unlike any other industry I've ever been involved with or seen from an impact perspective, right? When you see the difference between a community where there has been very low subsistence farming, very little industrialization at all, suddenly the effect and the benefit that mining has from an infrastructure perspective, service mining services perspective, and then the community growth, development, skills transfer perspective, the community building, the involvement, it's phenomenal. It's hard to understand. Once you witness it and see it, you get it. And a lot of our Australian companies are so good at doing that and are in Africa because of the impact that they make, right? And so, sorry, we digress. But going back to the service company, because the shift now from a local content perspective, and we'll chat about it a bit later as well, is that we're now seeing more pressure from governments coming down to say, well, it needs to be local ownership. And so now it's, okay, so how do we...
That has its own issues and own
Absolutely.
problems, doesn't it? Yeah.
So how do you now
It's what we see in
navigate
the news.
a global company with a local director, and how do you protect your business and make sure that that can keep functioning in this environment where you have a very different setup now? Because previously this has not been the case. You can come in and operate, you employ local people, you train them up, and they've been happy enough as a host government that is providing a lot of skills. It's providing local content. You're setting up local businesses, whether it's building, sewing your own PPE and buying that back from them from a mine perspective, or if it's a project like Basted with their Kenya mineral sands, where they put in cotton. They created massive cotton farms, and that cotton eventually they did a deal, I think with Cotton On in Australia, and effectively closed the whole loop. So they were supplying cotton into Australia for garments that then got sort of distributed globally, right? So they're phenomenal stories like that. But because it is such a complicated environment, and because of this continues to shift from an Africa perspective, and because you're not dealing with a single country, everything is changing constantly. So you might be operating there for 20 years, never needed to pick up the phone to AAMEG or anyone within that realm. And suddenly you find yourself in a situation where legislation has shifted, or local expectations are now different, or there are pressures, geopolitical pressures suddenly being pushed down on governments that are pushing them in a different direction. And so now how do you cope with that, and what can you do? And so we support mining companies, service companies around navigating that. And one of the things, going back to the, moving from South Africa into Australia, the one thing that I remember driving down one of the roads in Bryanston and seeing kids begging at traffic lights, and seeing the disparity between, and this is true for most developing economies, right? The disparity between the people that have money and are wealthy and the people that have nothing.
It's always the case, mate, the haves and the have-nots.
Absolutely, right. And I think for me, one of the things that I just felt so completely helpless about, how do you, as Doug, how do you change this? Like, how do you have an impact, right? Because as an individual, and you it's like you'd be dropping a little drop of water into a massive ocean. Like, how is it possible? And what I started finding, going back to the Australia-Africa business days, is that if I could explain and help people invest and understand it, they could take their money and invest. And then indirectly, I'm having some sort of an impact, right? And so that remains true with a lot of what we do now, is because by assisting, supporting, advising, connecting people with networks on the ground, pulling in experts on specific issues, we effectively help support that investment in country, which then hopefully turns into sustainable long-term impact and the industrialization of that community, that region, and that particular country, right? Where you see the impact with where someone like West African Resources, the impact they've had in Burkina, Perseus over a number of their different countries, the impact that they've made and are now making in Tanzania, the positive impact, it's dramatic, mate. It really is incredible.
Where do you think Australian businesses are getting it right, the ones that you're currently working with, and getting it wrong when it comes to working with Africa?
Okay, good question. Where they are getting it right is in their approach. Very different approach from most other countries, if I can call it that. If you took a country approach, Australia's approach to things is very different in terms of how they get on the ground, what they do on the ground, how they understand, they take the time and effort to
Are you
understand.
talking about permitting, like liaising with government?
I'm talking about everything. Like the guys, one of the companies, for example, was going into a new area, country they've never operated in. They had their security community guy on the ground 6 months. And for a long time in that 6 months, before they even put a boot on the ground, they're trying to understand what's going on.
What's the security guy doing?
Engaging with local people, understanding what's going on, getting a lay of the land, talking to local communities, understanding where the pressure points are, what's going on. Is organized crime an influence? Is it not an influence? Are there other geopolitical things at stake? Is corruption an issue? Is it not an issue? What is the perception of it?
Australian perception or perception of Africa, certainly political.
Yeah.
What does it look like? Dangerous. Is it dangerous to be I've heard stories about big, we've had people on the show that have spoken about, guards at the gates, the whole mining perimeter is covered in fences. There's machinery being stolen. There's crime. So what is there any countries to be mindful of not going into, or and how does your company work to?
Yeah, Josh, I think there are some, I say, rules of thumb, right? So generally, there are a couple of things, obviously, that drive projects, right? Good geology, and if you can get money for it, right?
Yep.
And so money often, depending on which region you're looking at, could be problematic, right? So if you try to go and invest in an opportunity in Eritrea right now, or even Zimbabwe right now, there are a number of sanctions against those. In Zimbabwe, against individuals. Eritrea have got some sanctions at sort of financial level. So there's some challenges around how do you go about investing there, right? So that's already going to sort of narrow what it is you do and where you do. Then you've got areas where there are open conflicts, right? Sudan, for example. So again, we have Australian companies that have tenements and things in Sudan, but that's nothing.
Not currently mining?
No, they're not going to be doing anything with that until that resolves itself, right? And so
likely to resolve itself anytime soon?
It's hard to know.
Yeah.
I think we saw Ethiopia and Eritrea some years ago, which took a long time to resolve, suddenly get resolved. Then more recently, Rwanda and the DRC, which it's been bubbling under for a long time. And again, in that specific case, that is so far away from the mining sector in the DRC, it has little to no impact. But at a global perception, it's suddenly a red flag, right? So for me, the nuance...
And that would turn investors off, like there's no tomorrow, right?
Of course. And and I think this is the thing, and going back to that understanding about, and I'll give you another example in West Africa, for example. So there were some issues in Mali where there were some disputes between the Mali government and some mining companies. And other companies operating in other countries, share price got hammered by 25% because it was West Africa. Right? So you have this knee-jerk reaction a lot of the time without understanding actually what's going on the ground. And that's unfortunate, but not unexpected. Right? Okay. So going back to your question about regions or crime, absolutely right. So gold's a good example. Gold, relatively easy to get out of the ground depending on what you're doing and where you're doing it and how you're doing it. Not always ethically, but a massive demand from organized crime, right? So you have...
Especially at the gold price, bloody hell,
Of course. And so those are some of the challenges that you then navigate. And so if you have a gold mine and whether you're operating or whether you're exploration or you're going to have to deal with artisanal mining at a level and illegal mining and what that looks like. And illegal mining, make no mistake, it's not... In some instances, it'll be small, very small operations, right? So guys going down chopping out the veins in the shafts, taking it out, then sort of dumping cyanide on it and getting the gold out, etc. But in other areas, they have trucks, they have excavators. They are not doing it on small scale, and that then is a very different problem, because then you need government intervention, and that tends to be either by the military or police. Not a lot, because again, you have to have the infrastructure to be able to stop that or change that or police that, right? So certainly, there are regions within countries that you've got to be careful about, right? So we've seen that over the years, and it's something that I think we will continue to monitor, and the guys do. So we have a very small group of very well-connected security networks across the continent that will try and keep people updated as what's going on, what's happening. We get reports into Canberra, which we get sent down to us, which we can get, have access to and have a look at. A lot of that is produced out of the US and the 5 Eyes networks and things in terms of where zones are and what's happening. But for the most part, it always comes back to that on-the-ground engagement, on-the-ground approach, how you're dealing with local communities, local regional governments, federal governments, if they have federal governments, and what those relationships are like, right? And so there's no substitute for really good relationships. And I'm not saying that that's the only thing that's going to work. It's not. It is a complicated environment, but the opportunity is incredible, right? When you look at what opportunities there are, when you look at countries, again, West Africa resources, their ability, and their ability to get a mine up and pouring gold, I think, and I was saying to be corrected, within about 4 years, just on 4 years, it's unheard of, right? And at Australian standards, Australian level, right? So this is also the thing, and going back to what you're saying, what Australian companies do really well, their ability to bring Australian technology, Australian health and safety, Australian way of working, it's phenomenal, mate. It really is phenomenal. And again, having worked in one of the previous roles where I was visiting Australian mine sites, UK mine sites, Chinese mine sites, some Russian mine sites, very different, very different. And so, yeah, I think from an Australia perspective, we are very fortunate to be in the position we do in terms of our approach to it.
Doug, looking 5 to 10 years ahead, where do you see Africa and the supply chain working with the critical minerals and the energy sector?
Josh, very interesting, right? So traditionally, when we look historically at Africa, we've seen investment from a number of regions. Right? Traditionally, the Chinese have been very invested in Africa and continue to be. Russia,
are they big players in Africa?
Absolutely,
bigger than Australian mining
by a long way.
Okay, what roughly? What percentage? What would we be looking at?
I couldn't even begin to think, mate.
Should we be having more Australian mining companies looking at expanding their operations into Africa?
Absolutely, 100%.
How do we go about that?
Well,
if you're an Australian miner, if you're an Australian miner doing it, and you've got money and you've got cash in the bank, and you're doing the right thing here, what's your stepping stone to Africa?
I think you spoke about gold. I think the opportunities around gold, it's about finding the right projects. And I think it's about the right destination or jurisdiction, right? So when you look at opportunities that are in Namibia, Botswana, Tanzania, where you look at some of the West African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, I think they are in the process of building around about 6 to 8 mines. And I think they've got about another 4 or 5 in the pipeline. Like, they are going to be a powerhouse when it comes to gold, particularly. Their regime is stable. Their legislation is stable. So it provides all of those very, very conducive elements that you need from a mining perspective.
Yep. What about critical minerals?
Critical minerals is a fascinating
She's a hot topic.
It's a hot topic, mate. And so the thing that we've now seen, right, if we've now seen over the last number of years, and more recently, interest out of the UK coming into Africa, so more projects being funded, more funds being developed for specifically Africa offtake. We've seen that happen from an EU perspective. We've just seen the US last year do a number of deals now, and they're going to continue to play a very big role. And we've seen the Middle East, so the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis moving in, and they have got deep pockets, right? And on two things, I say two things. One, investing in local projects and things across the continent, but then also looking at offtake to take into Saudi to build their capacity in terms of their own industrialization, right?
Yep.
And their move away from just fossil fuels, right? So it's becoming one of the most contested geopolitical spaces there is in the world at the moment from a critical minerals perspective, and trying to find where those geopolitical alignments are, right? For example, Turkey have over 40 embassies and consulates across Africa. Now, no one would suspect that, right?
I wouldn't have at all.
And they do a lot of work in the construction space, contracting infrastructure. They've got military contracts with a bunch of people, some military supply. Wow. And so these are players that have never, they're not in the headlines, right? They've been there forever. And so Africa now, and certainly host governments now, are having the ability to have conversations with the Middle East, with the Chinese, with the UK, Europe, with America in some instances where they're chasing particular minerals. And so it's definitely changing the conversation where traditionally that wasn't the case. So next 5 years is going to be full of opportunities. We're seeing money and financing moving into Africa a lot more. And again, it's got to be the right project, right? They're not going to fund everything. I think two other points I'd like to make around Africa in the next 5-10 years. One is from 2030, they are going to have the biggest youth population going into the workforce in the world. The rest of the world combined won't match them. And that goes for the next 15, 20 years, right? So the projections.
Wow.
So they're going to have masses and masses of youth and people coming into the employment sector that need employment, looking for jobs, looking for opportunities. And this goes back to the pressure around.
Are they going to be looked after, mate?
Well, this is the thing. We go back to the earlier statement around that local content, local ownership. How do you develop that? And again, mining is such a key component of building that industrialization, right? Because you think about what mining starts at, right? Whether it's a trench or a couple of holes, and then that goes through the construction phase. And suddenly now you need mining suppliers. So whether it's drilling contractors earlier, but the contractors, suppliers to the mine, food to the mine. So suddenly it creates the base or the catalyst at the center of that ecosystem and infrastructure system. And that then creates the other opportunities, right? And again, Africa, outside of the traditional gold and all of those things, phenomenal phosphate deposits, right? Industrial sands, industrial minerals deposits, which are critical to everything we do these days. And their need is only going to increase and continues to increase. So I'm extremely optimistic about the opportunity, what it is. I think it's a place you need to be cognizant of as to how you approach it and what you do. But if you come with the right mindset from an Australia context, you are way ahead of a lot of the other countries when they look at it and how they do business, right?
Mate, ESG is no longer optional. It's everywhere. And what do you think, obviously with the 54 different countries in Africa, once again, it goes back to some countries will be doing it better than others. What's your thoughts on ESG in Africa, especially after saying that there's going to be a heap more workers available? And what do you think Africa's going to do, or why would a company want to turn up to Africa and use those employees, but also being able to look after them?
Yeah, Josh, it's
a bit of a bloody long-winded question.
So again, the ability to make an impact in Africa, and again, not only Africa, a lot of the developing countries and regions, right, through mining is phenomenal. So from a mining perspective, an investment in mining services in Africa and partnering with local companies and JVing and growing, etc., you have this incredible ability to actually make a difference. So from at that level alone, the opportunity is phenomenal. right? So that continent is not going away anytime soon. And it is going to be more and more important globally from a supplies perspective, right? From an ESG perspective, the Australian approach to ESG and general operating is already well within the realms and do more than most when it comes to operating on the ground.
Definitely.
And they years and years and years ago, if you looked at mining companies popping into different regions or setting up in regions, they would possibly put down a borehole, and so that the local community had water, and they might try and do a few other things. It's far more sophisticated now. It's setting up micro industries. It's setting up farming. It's helping with that longer term sustainability around programs that will last long after the mine is closed effectively. So a lot of their approach is looking at, so this is a 5, 10, 15, 20-year life of mine. What does that look like? How do we secure some of that talent? What do we need to do in terms of training, educating? How do we get the skills to the level that we are comfortable having that sort of skills within our minds so that they meet our regulations and meet our standards, right? And when I say ours, from an Australian operating perspective, because the standards are extremely high. And we've seen that continue throughout the African countries when it comes to Australia and how they approach things. Some of the things that we are working on in the background from an AAMEG perspective as well is having conversations with the producers and the guys that are in that sort of mid-tier junior space is, what do we need to do long-term? How do we find that training education? How do we move or how do we support the people coming in, working their way through the organization to get into the management, the senior management? What are the programs available, right? When you look at the Waxy Institute, which is run out of, it's a collection of guys, but out of UWA, have been doing a huge amount of training capacity, PhD work in the West Africa space. You look at WASM School of Mines, they've got a base in Mauritius, right? And they continue to do a lot of training and education. I know Curtin Uni is busy looking at the potential of a campus in Africa and what that potentially looks like and what that could be. So
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
But these are part of the challenges ahead right now. It's still early days in a lot of those conversations, but we're starting to think about how do we address these things, because we know that the Australian mining companies have been operating on that continent for 40, 50 years. So how do we make sure that we can continue to operate there and continue with best practices? How do we contribute to the continent? How do we build the capacity? How do we help governments with youth unemployment? Because very recently, in the last year or so, we've seen Tanzania, civil unrest post-elections in Tanzania, civil unrest post-elections in Madagascar. We've seen Kenya have a stint at it. And it's that unhappy youth, disenfranchised, that feeling that they don't have a future. And so the only way that we can, from an Australia mining industry perspective, help any of that is by helping that capacity building, putting those programs in place, working with governments and host governments around how do we...
Having an education system on the ground.
Yeah, and there are very good education systems across Africa in the different regions, right?
Yep.
So in some countries, you find that the challenge is not finding someone with an MBA. The challenge is finding someone that can do boiler making and welding on a particular site, and that's what the challenge is in a particular region. It's not because there's a lack of education, but you need to have the
lack of trades,
right skills.
lack of skill.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's different for each region. And Namibia is a great one, right? So Namibia is this incredibly beautiful, massive country, 3 million people, a number of mining companies, Australian companies on the ground there, and about to open up oil and gas and starting to explore in that space as well.
Wow.
So you have got a country that is, over the next number of years, going to be desperate for highly skilled people, oil and gas, all of that sort of stuff, to benefit from the potential opportunities from an mining oil and gas perspective, right? And so it has a massive impact. And if you're not thinking about that now, and how do you help the host government, and how do you help with capacity building and training and education, you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? It's a no-brainer. And it's something that we fortunately, as an Australian mining sector approach really well. We have incredibly good mining technologies. The met sector are world leading. And so it has this ability to really make an impact. And the other great thing about having this technology in Western Australia associated with mining is that it gives countries and developing countries the ability to leapfrog technologies, right? So it's that same old thing. You don't necessarily now have to go and put copper cable in the ground for phone lines because you've got Starlink connectivity, right? So they can skip the whole copper cable story right from the get-go. You just go straight to Wi-Fi, right? So there are those sorts of leaps that technology can make, and particularly Australian mining tech. So I'm extremely optimistic, mate.
Yeah, mate, I can see. I can see that. Mate, look, this is the last one for me, and we've, we had a good run last year of people giving some advice, some great advice that they've heard, received, and then passed on. What would yours be, Doug?
Geez, I think there's a lot that has impacted or shaped things, conversations, things I've heard over the years. I think the thing that I try to link in terms of when I'm looking at doing things is how do I add value to that particular thing, right? So in this particular role, what are the things that I bring to the role, and what can I add value? And if that is not something I can see clearly, then you need to make a move, right? So it has to be relevant to either the stage of the business or the opportunity that you're looking at. So for me, it's very much around how do you have that impact, and what can you do around that to make the most of that opportunity. I think one of the other things that consistently comes back to me is if you say you're going to do something, do it, and do it again. Because if you're trying to build credibility, or you're trying to do something, and if that's your natural approach, that you say something, this is what we're going to do, you deliver on it, you say something, that automatically then builds trust. And so, and you're not always going to get it right? But that's okay, because they know that 90% of the time when you say something, you're going to be delivering on it. And yes, things will go wrong, because that happens.
It's the nature of the beast.
That's life, mate. It goes like that. I think the last thing that constantly sits in the back of my head is it goes back to integrity, right? So it's that integrity, right? It's one of each of us have our own unique way, and it's finding what that is and how that then impacts in what it is you're doing. And whether that is cutting food and cleaning floors in the restaurant, how you do that, taking the bins out, or whether you are running a large mining service company or a large bank or a agribusiness, or it comes down to how you manage that, how you run it, what are you doing, what are you bringing your experience into that. And if I've found a few times me sitting in a space and I'm thinking I'm either not at the right level to add enough value, or I'm never going to be able to add enough value. And at that point in time, it's time to exit. You need to find a way out of that. We all have a limited amount of time here. None of us know when that is.
That's right.
And so for me, it's very much about trying to utilize that as best you can. And hopefully you're going to get some of it right? So you're not always going to get it right, but...
Well, mate, the information that you've been able to pass on to us and our viewers today is fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and sit down with me. I'm sure that there's some bloody operators in Australia that'll be watching this thinking, well, we better get in contact with Doug. We want to expand our operations into Africa. And I guess even if they are already working there and, maybe they're not dealing with AAMEG, they probably should be. Because I think the value's there.
I think the conversation is worth having, irrespective, right? And again, I think I'm also very much of the opinion that I don't expect everyone to join AAMEG. That's not the idea. But certainly, if I can connect you into someone who can help, or if I can, through the networks, leverage someone's expertise to make your life slightly easier than it was for the guy before you, and we're able to expand and grow Australia's interest in Africa, happy. Then we're winning, mate.
Beautiful. Well, mate, once again, thank you very much for your time.
Josh,
much appreciated. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
It was very good. Thank you so much, mate.
Not a problem.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning into another episode, our first episode of 2026. Much appreciated. Thanks for all your support. And don't forget, as Dimitri keeps saying, like, subscribe, and comment down the bottom. Cheers.